All right, y'all. Hello, and welcome to the second episode of Writerly Conversations in this season 2. Oh my gosh, I cannot believe we're rolling, 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 rolling on a river.
Everything is a song with Brit.
Absolutely. What? Of course. We're rolling. So, introductions before I forget, as I often do. As you can see, I'm sitting on my couch. So if there's like shadows rolling across my face, I just need you to go with it. I'm cozy today.
I like how we're 2 for 2 with us being in new locations for season 2.
Are we?
Yeah, because remember last month I was in my bedroom.
Well, listen.
We're changing it up.
We're switching it up. You gotta keep up with it. So I'm Britt. This is my channel, Brittwriterly. It's a book and author too, where I talk about the intersections of literature and culture. If any of that sounds interesting to you, check it out. This is one of my favorite collaborations. This is one of my favorite videos on my channel is Writerly Conversations, really thinking critically about books, and I always do, right? But thinking critically about books from a writing perspective is different than thinking critically about books from the perspective of like a reader or a reviewer. So I love having these conversations with Shay, my lovely co-host, and I will let her introduce herself right now.
Hello, everybody. My name is Shay, and my channel is Shay with the Hobbies. I write short stories, poetry, and the occasional blog post. So yeah, eventually I'm going to change that because I'm really like, I want something new. So yeah.
Okay, so this is like I said, it's season 2, episode 2. Oh, by the way, if y'all are watching, thank you for watching, and make sure you smash that like button and ring that bell so you don't miss a single upload, and make sure that you do that on my channel and Shay's channel, since Writerly Conversations alternate. Today's conversation has been a long time coming. It sort of grew out of a conversation we had in November, maybe October. Even October.
Yeah, because it was Preptober. We were talking about it in preparation for NaNoWriMo.
Okay. In my head, I'm so comfy. Like I can kick my whole leg up. Kick your leg up. I'm sorry, I'm sanctified. So what this listen, I actually haven't heard that song in years. Do you know that song?
Yeah, it's kick your leg up. Lean to the side. Yeah. What you talking about?
I heard that song literally since I was in like high school. But every time I think of my leg moving, that song comes to mind. But I am sanctified and sealed. So I when we had those conversations about Preptober and Nano, that got us thinking more about things that are not inherently toxic, but can be applied in a way that makes them like, oh, that can become sort of an issue or sort of tricky if we over apply that, or if that becomes a sort of convention, right? So we talked about the toxicity of NaNoWriMo, not the organization, just the time of year and the way that people can like throw themselves into it without with a lot of anxiety rather than using it as a time of community, right? And so in a similar fashion, that's when I started thinking about this conversation on Save the Cat by Jessica Brody. So Save the Cat writes in novels by Jessica Brody. The original Save the Cat was written by Blake Snyder. So she adapted it to novel writing. The original one was about screenwriting, screenplay writing. And a lot of writers swear by Save the Cat. And a lot of people recommended Save the Cat to me when I first started sharing my manuscript. I was talking to other writers about it. Here's what it's about. Here's the response I'm getting from agents or editors. And a lot of them are talking about pacing. And as soon as I said pacing, they were like, oh my gosh, you have to read Save the Cat. And they were right. Like Save the Cat is a really, really great craft book for fixing all of your pacing issues. It really, really is. And so the difficulty can come when the way that Save the Cat gets applied is formulaic, right? And so we're going to be talking about today the way that formulas can become a problem. Now, I do want to say, for those of you who have read Save the Cat, and those who have not, she says that Save the Cat is not meant to be formulaic, that she has studied stories that are written recently, stories that were written as early as 1700, and that she has seen a pattern of storytelling, or she calls it an underlying code of storytelling, that most stories already adhere to, and Save the Cat is her explaining that code. And so, sure, fine. So then we're talking about what happens when codes become formulaic and the way that they get applied, and when they get applied in ways that interpret them in the most like catastrophic way. What does that mean? We'll get into it. Shay, I've been talking a lot. Do you have anything that you want to say before we get like specific?
No. I will say that, like, as far as Save the Cat is, I have not, get back to the one thing that we know about me as of yet. Y'all will be the first people to know when it does happen. I've not finished a novel. So I've not used Save the Cat to get through like different areas of beats or anything like that. But I did go into it like going in with the, hey, I need the outline. I know that these are different things that I need to be aware of. People swear by it. It's, becoming an industry. Like, hey, have you read this? Have you read this? Have you read this? And everybody who's published, who wants to give you advice, they always bring up this book. So that being where I'm at in coming into it. So that's all. So let's get into it. Britt, take us away.
Okay, so I'll start with YA fantasy because I always start with YA fantasy, both because that's what I read and also that's what I write. So no wonder we start there. And then we'll pan out to romance genres, which we don't talk about a lot on in writerly conversation. We tend to talk about either contemporary or YA fantasy, unless we're talking about explicitly Black level. We're going to talk about romance in a wider way, and then we'll also talk about like general fiction, right? So starting with YA fantasy, a lot of the beats in Save the Cat when it comes to like transitioning have to do with like a catalyst and a debate. So a thing that makes you have to change, and then your resistance to do it. And that's how it works with us. For us to change, something has to happen to make us change, and we don't always want to change. That's the catalyst debate, right? And so that's what mobilizes a lot of the beats in Save the Cat. I think it makes total psychological sense. So again, none of what we're saying is like Jessica Brody is trash. She's setting stuff. Not at all. It's the way that it's being interpreted that I am like, I take exception to this, right? So what does that have to do with YA fantasy? A lot of, and I've been seeing it on Twitter too, with people being like, can we just have like happy Black stories, right? That has to do with what I think is like trauma porn getting into our YA fantasy. So we see a lot of dark fantasies, which is funny because Shay would say that I write dark fantasy, and I don't.
No. So I don't think you write dark fantasy. I do think you include darker themes in your fantasy.
Oh, okay.
Like when I think of dark fantasy, there's still too much positivity and love and intimacy that is good for me to consider it dark fantasy. I just don't think you'd be like, nah, these are some dark themes though, sis. Like this is some heavy stuff. This ain't no walk in the park type story. Like, they might love each other in the end, but bruh, they went through some stuff.
Life to me ain't been no crystal stair. So yeah, okay, great. So I don't write dark fantasy. There are dark elements in my fantasy. Great. So with the rise that we've seen of dark fantasy, the rise that we see a lot of fantasies where parents are dead, either at the beginning or by the end. where there's just like a lot of like mortal danger. And I'm not saying like that's all trash. A lot of the books that I love have these, so I'm not dumping on anyone. I'm just saying this, and that's the last caveat I'm going to give also, because you know how we roll over here. We say it once and we're done. So what I'm saying is that trend of people dying, and there's just hit after hit after hit after hit to these protagonists, like they can't have a happy life. I think that is, I won't say a misinterpretation, because I think the authors are doing what they mean to do, but I think it's an interpretation that gives us these trauma porn like stories where, we're talking about Black white fantasy, these Black boys and girls are just going through so much loss, because it's not necessarily diversified types of obstacles. I'm typically seeing it as someone died. It's not different types of stakes. It is life and death. And I think that is coming from different places in Save the Cat 2 in particular. So there's a part at the end of Act 2, and it's called the All Is Lost beat. And typically in that beat, a mentor will die. So someone that character has come up to, has someone who has walked alongside that character, has taught them what they need to know. They will die at the end of Act 2. And then at the end of Act 3, during the finale, there's this thing called the B-story sacrifice. And I'm just literally looking at the book, and it says this is a sub B where a lot of secondary characters or team members make a B-story sacrifice, sacrificing themselves for the cause. They start dropping off. Maybe they die, maybe they take a bullet for the hero, or maybe they simply move aside to allow the hero a chance to shine. So I want to say, like, again, it doesn't have to be death, but that's the interpretation that we're seeing. And I think that's creating a formula out of Save the Cat that was unintentional. And that is one of the things that I'm just like, why are we as writers choosing to remove characters from our protagonist's vicinity via death? Like, why are we not having stories where they just choose to step aside, or where the B-story sacrifice doesn't have to be a B-story character? Why can't a B-story sacrifice be a B-story character learning a lesson that they needed to learn that makes them step back, so that our protagonists can shine? And so I think that there's a choice and a trend happening where there is just so much blood and gore in our YA fantasies, and it is becoming trauma porn because we care about these B-story characters. The protagonist cares about them. And what we're seeing is all of these books are full of loss and grief. And it seems at some point like it ceases to matter because we expect it now. We expect these characters to die. We expect it to be heart-wrenching, gut-wrenching, all the things. And it's like, at some point you become inured to it or numb to it, where it's just like, yeah, that's just how stories go. But it's not. Like, I don't want to naturalize death for anyone, especially if the B-story characters are Black. Like, let's not naturalize people dying violently.
The truth is death isn't that common, because if it was, as a society, we would handle it better. Like, the truth is, most of us didn't grow up losing friends left and right via death.
Yeah.
Like, growing up in the hood, yes, definitely grew up with a lot of people in the school that I went through dying. I was a senior in high school before it was someone I actually grew up with and knew, right? So, like, there are those things in ways that, yeah, that's true, but it's also not that common for everybody. And right. Y'all are making this comment for everybody. White, Black, Hispanic, if it's fantasy and it's YA, somebody gotta die.
Right.
And there's something to be said about creating a world where the mentor, the guidance, the parent that actually cares, the person who's actually there and rooting for them, is the person that y'all see fit to take away from them. Like, because the truth is what you are creating is a sense of hopelessness for that character
that they then have to get through in the darkest night.
It doesn't have to be that way. You can be down, upset, downtrodden, reflective. You can be going through all these things about something that happens, and it doesn't have to be because of death. Because the thing that we're not acknowledging is death is a, for the most part, final thing. Like, right, we have necromancy stories or stuff like that, like that. But in general, for most stories, a death is a final thing. And in most situations, the relationships that we dead are not dead in that way. They're not final this way, right? And I just think that also, I feel like it says something about conflict resolution that we just kill people. I just want to say that. Like really? Like, did it? We can't work through this. We can't.
That's it.
I just
chopper.
I don't know. That's just me though. But continue. I'll let you take the floor. Cause yeah. And y'all see this?
No, I felt like I was droning on. It's writerly conversation, so feel free. Like,
yeah, no, you're totally fine. I was just like, when you were saying it, these were the things that I was thinking about, specifically because, you know, like, y'all know I have a thing against writing YA because I just don't like to write young characters, because I'm just like, y'all want kids to be stupid, and I just wasn't a stupid kid, so I just can't write these characters. I can't relate, so I'm not going. And you're not gonna get me to write a dumb character. You're just not. You're going to get me to write a character that's naive, but not that stupid. You know what, bro? There's a difference between naivety and stupidity.
There definitely is.
They're not the same. And so I was thinking about the youngest character that I have, or the younger two characters that I have, would be Asharia from Jesus Never Went to College, and Charisse from Blankets and Burglaries. And even in both these things, they're like, I want to say, well, Charisse is like 20, so she's not a teenager, but they're younger adults, right? In the situation,
which we need.
Which we need, right? We need them. But in all these situations, like, never is there death involved. They're going through things, and there are going to be issues, and there are going to be problems, right? Like, there are going to be times where they're fighting with their friends, or this friendship is showing itself to be rocky in places. But like, I can give them conflict, I can give them high stakes without killing people. I don't know. It just makes me feel like I just don't, like, even when I think about like Charisse and her mother, like, her mother's not gonna die. Like, she's gonna work out her issues with her mom, and it might take 5 books for her to finally stand up to her mother and have a great conversation. But I'm not gonna kill off her mom just because it's gonna make her reflect on how she treated her mom.
Right.
No, like, she can reflect on how she's treating her mom while her mom is still alive. Like, because that creates this regret, that creates this guilt, that creates a whole nother list of mental health issues that she gonna have to deal with. That one, we could have just fixed this problem while your mama was alive, so you don't have to deal with that.
Right.
I don't know. I feel like I was like rambling, but I was like, this is just something that just bothers me. Is it's like, I agree. Why don't we ever deal with things?
Because we see that with other, like,
Wings of Ebony.
I literally was like, her dad dying in Wings of Ebony when he did, without her. She had a year. Yeah. She had a year to have a relationship with him and did not. And I'm just like, and stubbornness, and JL has said stubbornness is one of Rue's characteristics. Like, it's one of her. I think sometimes stubbornness can be a fatal flaw, and sometimes it's just a characteristic, right? Like, there's a high functioning and a low functioning side of stubbornness. But her stubbornness prevented her from having a relationship with her dad, from forgiving him for trying to understand how he could, why he would, and how they could move forward. And then she didn't come to a place where she could fully forgive him until he died and gave her those memories. And now she's left with that guilt. And she already has the weight of the world on her shoulders. She has to deal with that as well now at the end of the book. So it's just like, again, we mark these points in our books by taking people from our characters violently. And sometimes in a way where it's their fault that they're dead. Had she not been tricked to go back home to Tasha and got jumped, Estim would not have come back to save her, because she already knew that if he traveled again, he was going to get the backlash from that curse. So it's just like, I just hate that. I think that there are some times where letting things be your character's fault, fine. Things are our fault all the time. It's just a thing. But tying something to being the responsibility when someone ended up dying, for that to be happening in so many of our YA fantasies, that's where I'm like, at this point, the code is being interpreted as a formula that is becoming a trend that I think says dangerous things to kids about how to process. First of all, it's just grief, and loss, and violent ways. Yes.
Before you continue, because I just want to hop on this real quick, it's not even grief. It's just loss, because in none of these stories do we ever really process grief, because the truth of the matter is processing grief takes years. In most of these stories, we don't get years with these characters. Like in Wings of Ebony, we're going through months to, like in Ashes of Gold, like months later. You're not processing these deaths. You didn't process your mother's death, which is the catalyst for the story that is Wings of Ebony, because she's only been gone a year. Like, so we're not even really talking about grief. We're literally creating situations where grief exists and not acknowledging it. And that's all I wanted to say. When you were talking about that, I was like, can we say this? Because that's the truth. The one book that I've read that talks about grief and deals with it is Clap When You Land. But that was the whole point of the book.
Yeah.
That was the whole point of the book. Every other book in which grief and death happens, we don't talk about it. It just is.
So grief is the setting.
Right. Grief is right.
So grief is the setting. And then loss continues to be threaded throughout in violent ways. And I'm just like, we don't see. Now, this is why I fantasy, but that sort of, I would say, formulaic injection of loss, that we can see that in other genres too. So like romance, I saw on Twitter, Venus was citing, when Vina retweeted something where an author was like, I don't see the point of other authors doing worst reads of the year, and Vina retweeted it and said something like, this is bringing back that conversation about when authors were getting on reviewers and fans for saying, stop breaking up our characters for no reason in the second act or third act or whatever. I think that needless breaking up of characters is part of, it's like a romance genre interpretation of the whiff of death. So like we get a bit of death by like someone dying or someone or clock starting, like that thing where the stakes get raised via that, by death. I think that the love interest breaking up in romance is sort of like the whiff of death in romantic genres. And I'll say, like, first of all, I don't write romance. Like, I write romance like subplots, but I don't write romance books. I don't think that every time someone breaks up, it's needless. But apparently in this situation, readers were saying you are breaking up characters needlessly, formulaically, and it don't even be making sense to the reader, but you just do it because, oh, it's the second act, the third act, or whenever they do it, it's time for them to break up. And what I will say is, I really, really love, y'all know I love Alexandria House. Queen. One of the things I love about indie publishing is that it allows you to not have to do things that you wouldn't do that you would have to do in trad pub. 2 examples. Alexandria House. You can read her entire catalog. You are not gonna see a single breakup that doesn't make sense. And I'm trying to think, and I'm like, I can only think of a couple of breakups in Alexandria House's catalog that even happened at that right time at the end of the second act that causes the character to have to think and reform and then come back for the reunion. I can only think of a couple of breakups that even happened during that time, but when they happen in that time, it makes sense. I see characters break up earlier than that in the book for better reasons. So like, what I like about Alexandria House is that her characters and her stories make sense, and they're not sacrificed to any particular formula. They just are what the characters need. And I think in trad pub, editors may publishers may incentivize writers capitulating to this formula by publishing all these books that look the same, and by not publishing writers who aren't doing that, to create this false narrative and this self-fulfilling prophecy that this is what readers like to see. Well, readers like to see that based on the numbers, but readers also don't have other choices of what to buy. So they're gonna, whatever they buy is gonna fall into that formula because that's what's out there. So they like to buy it, but you don't know if they really like to buy it given other options, right? So one is like Alexandra House. She doesn't really move in a formulaic way, but the other is this, my favorite fantasy series, the Amaranthine Saga. Forthright, who is the author, it's a pen name. The way that Forthright moves, the pacing, she would never be able to get away with that in Tripub. Like on a series level and on a book level, she would never be able to get away with it. And not because she doesn't do like go by Save the Cat, although I don't know that she does, honestly. Like I'm thinking through, I'm like, I don't really see Save the Cat beats functioning as explicitly as I see them work in YA fantasy. If they're there, she has moved them around hugely. But I like the things that she does because I don't get to see them often, but they work for the story that she set up, for the characters that she set up, for the world that she set up, and for the whole aesthetic and mood of her series. It works. And I just want us to break out of this dark and violent and irresponsible in a way, because again, right, going back to the grief, we're having an excess of grief that's not even being processed. This is for young adults. This is for children. It's kid lit. So then why are we having grief that's not being processed? And not to say that no book processes it, right? Because some books do. I appreciate in Legendborn that in the author's note, Tracy Dion says, and in the book, the therapist Patricia says, Bree, I think you have something called traumatic grief syndrome, wherein it lasts for a very protracted time and you feel all these different things and there are these different triggers or whatever, right? Like that conversation is had, and I really appreciated the careful tending to of losing a loved one, particularly a mother, right? So it does happen, but it doesn't happen enough for all the grief that we're seeing, is what I'm saying. The different kinds of grief. Losing a parent and losing a friend and losing a best friend are not the same thing. And we don't deal with those with the nuance that those losses demand. And that's why I'm just like, it's becoming a formula and a trend that I think is toxic.
And I'd say another form of this, I think, is the gutting of the YA best friendships that happens in stories.
Talk about it.
We have main characters that just have no friends whatsoever, or they have a best friend and then something happens. Usually it's something that it doesn't even really make sense for it to be the reason why you lose your best friend. I've noticed, for me, in my opinion. And it doesn't get clarified. It doesn't get fixed. There are not conversations about it. It's just the death to this friendship. And again, like I was saying earlier, like it says something about conflict resolution, right? It says something that the biggest way to dead relationships in literature seems to be miscommunication. And like, it's a trope for a reason. And it's irritating because, again, I say this all the time, it's something that we talk about quite often, is literature informs culture. It informs and it helps to create the realities that we see in ways, right? Like that is the truth of what literature does. So reading all of your favorite characters who this is how they handle friendships and relationships, and they're strong and they're the most beautiful and all the guys want them and they have everything that they want at the end of the story, but they handled everything horribly up until then, gives you this false reality that these bad things are going to give you this positive ending, and it's just not true. You're going to end up alone. Here is the truth of the matter. Nobody wants to be completely alone in real life. Humans in nature want to be around other people, right? Like I am alone 90% of my time, but the 2 days a week that I get to see somebody else and we hang out and we're spending time together, are necessary. Every other day, hey, I'm by myself, I need it. Right? Like, I understand you can want to be alone. You can be an introvert. You can not like people, but you still need people. Like, that is how we are created. That is how we move. That is just us in general, especially those of us that are Americans. Like, it's just a thing, right? So it doesn't make sense that we create these worlds meant for children in which they're all alone all the time. And this loneliness doesn't ever get dealt with. Like, because the truth is, part of why the pandemic was so traumatic, is so traumatic for so many people, is because most of us aren't used to just being alone. Let alone being alone, going through traumatic things. Like, it's just not a thing. And I just think it's giving a false reality. And then the thought is, well, it's fantasy. So even in your fantasies are hell? Like, I don't understand that. Like, you're in your fantasy is death and loss. Or your fantasy is that you can go through death and loss and not feel it and still come out great. Like, it sounds like an illusion and not just a fantasy. Like it.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. It just, I feel like this is where words don't mean what we think they mean. I don't know.
I mean, you just, at some point, you just have to decide what elements of the story are fantasy. That's it. Like, is the world building the only fantasy, or is the fantasy the entire scenario, including the characters and their emotions? Because if that's what it is, put that at the beginning of the novel. Dedication to my readers. I love young readers. Just so you know, this entire book is a fantasy, including the characters and their emotional registers. Completely fantastic. So they know this is not how it works. Because, and I've said this before, like when I did my facts and factors of literature through the genres, and I talked about my video, Why Girls Don't Like Each Other. Now, I think that culture and literature inform each other, right? Like, there is no one-to-one. Like, we're mixing or mingling. There's a conversation, and then we get these things. So I think that, and so when I do see Why Girls Don't Like Each Other, I think in some ways it's unrealistic or unhealthy, but in other ways I do hear these little girls out here talking about, I don't have no friends, that's why I don't deal with females. And I'm like, you're so lost. You're so lost. Because these boys don't care about you for anything but one. That's why all my friends are guys, which is not healthy. And at the same time, then you have all of these feminists, all these hashtag feminists. And I'm just like, even if we're not using Alice Walker's definition of womanism, right? A woman loving other women, being committed to the political emancipation, liberation, fullness, freeness of other women. Even if we're not using Alice Walker's definition of womanism. Even Brittany Cooper, right? Her book, Eloquent Rage, which is her second book, but that's the more public facing of her two books that she has out right now. Even Brittany Cooper says at the beginning of her book, Eloquent Rage, you cannot be a feminist if you don't like women. Period. Before we even get theoretical with it, you can't be a feminist if you don't like women. So we have all of these people claiming feminism, but we're writing young ladies who are surrounded by dudes, love triangle after love triangle, and weak female relationships. So that's why I'm like, I do think that culture and literature reflect each other, but I think literature has the power, I know literature has the power to unsettle, to question, to confront, to critique things in culture, not just mirror it. Because that just reifies it, that just supports it, that just reproduces what already is, rather than saying, I know there's this trend of girls saying that you don't have no friends, but let me show you how destructive that will be through this girl, let's call her Fantasia, whatever her name is, Ashanti, Elizabeth, all these different girls, whomever, in whatever genre, that don't have good, strong female relationships, that's gonna run itself out into destruction at some point. Because that's not a full social life to only have guy friends because you don't trust other women. What does that say? And so when we get into this reflection of culture only without also having a critique of culture, we run into trends that just reflect the most toxic parts of culture because it's dramatic and it's good for a story, as opposed to how can we have good stories that also teach readers some things about what they might want to reassess in their own life, especially young readers.
You said, you were talking about friendships and female friendships. And here's the thing. And this has been my experience, and this is the truth of the matter. Females are not good friends when they're younger. I feel like women become better friends as they get older, because I did not have nearly as many female friends when I was younger. Mainly because like there's a lot of unspoken like competition between girls like that I never even realized was a thing. And I know for me this is mine is slightly slanted because I was like homeschooled for quite a while, so I was coming into public school from like a homeschool thing, so there are like cultural and societal things that like went straight over my head because grew up in a very Christian home, so I don't get those things. And I would have more conversations and more friendships with males. And then as I got older, the women that I came into contact with, the maturity levels and the things that we had dealt with began to shift and begin to change. So now I do have a lot more female friends, or females that I would consider really close friends than I've ever had at any point in my life. And most women I know have more female friends as they get older than they do when they're younger. And I think that part of this goes back to the things that we see in film, in rereading books, and these things. We are given most shows with females, the friendships are adults. They're adult women in female friendships and shows. In shows with kids, most of the time it's a mixed group of friends. Most of the time it is more males than females. And that, again, going back to both reality informing film and literature and film informing reality, like that's a part of the conversation, is what if we started to change that? What if we started to write more shows where there are all female casts in a younger form and they're not all catty, right? Like they're not all Pretty Little Liars, because those were toxic friendships, right? Like they might have been friends for a long time, but those were horrible friendships. Right? Like if we get really good friendships, right? What if we get a living single, but while they're in high school, right? Or a living single while they're in college, right? What if we, I'm already working on it, but we get a different world, but it's a Black boarding school. Like, what if we get these
That's
different
what I want. All these Black boarding school books we're getting.
Right.
All these boarding school books we're getting with only a couple of Black kids.
Where we're putting Black kids in all white spaces. Here's the thing. The truth of the matter is we used to have over 100 Black boarding schools in this country. We're down to like 3. We're not going to talk about why that is, because obviously white boarding schools have not disappeared in that same vastness. But that being a thing, there's history there. There's things there to be put. So why are we making these I don't know. It's just, I can't even get the words out of my mouth. It's bothering me so much.
Why are we overrepresenting Black people in these all white spaces? Like that's the only reality there is. And what I'll be interested to know is,
one thing I want to say before you say that, even when we do, it's never realistic. Because even when we as Black people have been in these all white spaces, we're not totally alone, because we don't allow ourselves to be. We find us. And y'all write these stories where we don't find us. So going back to, what is your fantasy? Go ahead.
Oh, that's really the question, which we'll be seeing. So that goes into what I was gonna say. A lot of the writers that we talk about, that we bring up, right, are in their first or second book. What will be interesting to see is, because I hear these writers say, well, I'm writing my experience. I'm not gonna hold you. I do then wonder what your fantasy actually is, but that's none of my business and we're not friends. So you don't have any obligation to answer my question. I just wonder. But if that's how you represent what your experience is, cool, great. So I wonder, maybe if in your second series even, right? Because if this series is you playing out what your experiences in a fantasy format for these writers that are giving us, specifically for writers that are giving us Black people in white spaces. And we don't just see that in YA fantasy. We see that across genres, really. So if that's what your first book is showing us, and we can think, y'all can go back through our catalog of our conversation. We talked about multiple books last year that did that. I want to see what your second book or second series is going to do. If your first book is in a series, okay, that'll play itself out and it'll continue to be what it is. But in your second series, I want to see, at what point are you going to start doing research to represent other things within the vastness of Blackness? So boarding schools, writing, we've seen a lot of people be like, oh, I want boarding school stories. Cool. Is your boarding school story going to be this one Black kid in this white space? Is it because, why don't we look into where all the Black boarding schools went? And can we have a story about that? Or can we have a story in one of those Black boarding schools that no longer exist? And then in your author's notes, you can tell us what happened to it. Like, can we do that work? Can we do that work? So it's just a point of like, write your story. Absolutely. I can't hold you. I write my stories, but I also do research to say, okay, writing is political. What else needs to be represented? What stories need to be given light that aren't given light? And where do I find them? What research do I need to do in order to be able to responsibly represent those stories? That's part of writing for me. And I guess I can't put my own politics onto every other writer, right. Black writer. I can't, but I'm just like, that's what I'm wanting. That's my frustration.
Right. Because as you were saying that, I was sitting there and I was like, here's the thing. You can feel how you want to feel, and I'm not going to hold you on your feelings. But the truth for me is that part of wanting to write your experience is selfishness. And for me, it's selfishness because in everything that I write, and Britt has read almost everything I've written, like definitely everything I've written since we've known each other. She's read it. And none of the characters have lived a life nearly as traumatic, as many things as I went through at all, right? And I don't ever plan to write a character that, right? And not because the things that I went through don't need to be told in a story, because they are getting told in these stories, just not in that way. And the truth of the matter is because never did I ever read stories that I felt should have been the ones that Black kids were reading at the time. Right? So if we think about that and we think about what stories do you want Black kids to see, right? Mm-hmm. Do you want Black kids to just be reading traumatic stories about being in these white spaces, right, with nobody else that looks like them just because that's what you went through? Or do you want them to read stories that make them feel proud, that make them feel that, yeah, I could be in these white spaces and I can still find people that look like me, that love me, that want to see me for me? Like, mm-hmm, there's something to be said to me about you working out your childhood trauma in books for the next generation. Because the truth of the matter is, you didn't want to be the only Black kid at your school. Even if you did live it, you didn't want to be there and feel like when you did meet other Black people, they didn't love you, that they didn't understand you, that you didn't fit in. You didn't like feeling like that. So why would you write a world in which other kids would read about that experience? Why wouldn't you give them what it is that you wish that you had? Like, to me, you're supposed to want better for the people that come after you. You're supposed to want them to have what you didn't. And that's what I write. So I'm not going to not talk about rape, but I'm not going to talk about it in the way that I experienced it. Right? Like, that's just the thing. I'm not going to not talk about single parent homes, but I'm not going to talk about it in the way I experienced it, because it's not about me. It's about what the next generation can learn from me and my experience.
That is so, that was even hard for me to hear, like, as a writer, when you were like, I think it's selfish and that you shouldn't be writing your own story. That's why I was like, I was looking away, because I was like trying to like process and listen to what you were saying. And I was like, dang, is it selfish? Because like we're writing it, why can't it be our own stories, right? But when it comes to, again, and I love how you talk about the ministry of writing, right? Like, we are not just writing to fulfill our own egos. We're writing because we feel called to write. We're writing because we have worlds within us that we really feel like the world needs. And so when we say it like that, and maybe not every writer does say it like that, right? But for writers that do say it like that, I feel like there's something that I have to say. Lorraine Hansberry says, write what you feel has to be said. So if I'm saying this is what has to be said, right? This is what needs to be said. This is my ministry. Well, ministry is service. At that point, if it's me writing what needs to be said, if these words are burning within me to offer the world, that ceases to be about what I want to represent. And it doesn't mean that it's not going to be things that I have experienced, right? Because you write what you know it because you've lived it or you've seen someone live it or whatever. That's its own kind of personal, intimate research. So I'm not saying just because you experienced it, never reproduce that in literary form, because, you know, there is value to people seeing themselves. But like you said, there are things that I experienced when I was at my undergrad alma mater that I probably would not write. Because it's already out there. People are already experiencing it. So for me, I'm like, what value? Why? Like, rather, I want to write the story that would have held me up to read when I was at my undergrad. What would have held me up was reading about Black kids at an HBCU, right? Somewhere that I'm not, because that's part of the fantasy to me, whether it's a contemporary book or a fantasy or whatever. It's a fantasy to me because I'm not there. I'm at a PWI dealing with these white folks and their raging racism, their unapologetic misogyny, the incompetence, the racial incompetence of white professors who then ask me to do their job. That's what I'm dealing with. So I don't really want to read about another character who is doing that exact thing. Like, it, to me, it's a little hopeless. I already know that it's a real thing. I already know, like, how is it affirming me? I'm already living it. I understand, and all of my friends are too. My Black friends are all the affirmation I need because we're in it together. We already know. So I don't need a story to affirm that this happens, because when you go to a PWI, mine anyway, like, we did talk about the experience of going to a PWI. I am in a historically Black sorority. I'm in AKA. So I hear from my sorority sisters who are also at PWIs, like, I had plenty of people exchanging the experience of being at a PWI as a Black woman. So the story that I would have wanted to see would have been beautifully lush with Blackness. Not Blackness in distress, just Blackness. Blackness not in distress would be the fantasy, really. So I'm just like, when you say, right, like, when you say it's selfish to process your childhood through stories for the next generation, if you don't want that for them, that was like, ooh, Am I doing that? Now, I don't know. I'm going to have to like sit with that. But that's another level of self-awareness to understand if the story that you want to tell is the best story for the next generation to read. And if you're saying it is, then to really discuss with yourself, with your critique partners, with other Black women who are in contact with Black children. This is the story that I'm thinking about. I feel two ways about it. Part of me feels super proud to tell this story because it's my story, and there are other kids who are living this, and I want to affirm them, and I want them to see themselves. And there are other parts of me that want them to be able to see other things that they're not living because they already know their story, and I want to show them another way. I want to talk to them about these Black boarding schools that they are not in, they don't exist anymore. But here's what they were, right? Like, I think that's at least a conversation that we have to be having with our inner circle, because it is vulnerable, it is hard, right? It is humbling. But if we're not willing to do all of that deep work, then how dare we put our characters through half the hell we put them through? So I think that that's a really smart, important assertion to make, that there can be a selfishness in writing that you might be able to justify within yourself, but that doesn't mean that it's expedient for the people that you say that you're writing for.
Right. And I think that for me is a part of, like, I think it does come with processing the things that you've been through, right? Like, and I know that for me, more than a lot of people I've met, I've been in therapy majority of my life. So majority of my life, I've been processing the things that I've been through on a very, like, let's get through this, let's work through this. And so for me, I am, and this is also where it's the ways in which writing can still be therapeutic. You can still work out your traumas, and you cannot put what you've been on the next generation, is why, like, majority of the characters that most in my books have the most closest experience to me are the side characters. So it's very, very clear, because I want to make sure that when we post this and when y'all watch this, that you don't think that I don't think people like me need to be in the stories, because they do, right? So the character that raised by their grandma isn't the main character, it's the side character, but it's the love interest. So you're gonna have to deal with that and know what that means for this character, right? Like, so it's still those things, right? So in Gia's Never Went to College, the main character grows up in a 2-parent home, but not the character that becomes her best friend, right? Like, that's a different experience, right? Like, she grew up in a Christian home like I did, right? And so does the main character. But growing up in a Christian 2-parent home is very different from growing up in a Christian single-parent home. It's not the same experience, right? And so the thing is that I feel like part of the therapy of writing is getting to write out the things that you wished you could experience, right? Getting to write out that fantastical part, right? Back to what is your true fantasy, right? So for me, my fantasy is happy Black people. My fantasy is healthy Black relationships, right? My fantasy is like acknowledging the wrongs that have been done, forgiving them, and working past them. Those are the types of relationships and stories that I want to be prominent in what I tell. Why? Because I want the next generation to see that, right? Because we think about everybody's goal and dream is for their writing to become a film or a TV show, right? Well, then that means that when you make my show, you got to deal with these relationships in the right way. That means that when kids watch this, if they never read the book, they're going to see those positive relationships. They're going to hear the bad things happen, but they're going to see that there's a positive way to handle them. They're going to see the bad things happen, and they're going to see that you can grow from them and you can be a better person. And I feel like that is the problem I have, is that we're not giving people hope. Like, and the hope that we give them is riddled with white supremacy when we do give it to them. And that's just a no for me, dog. Like, I just cannot.
Yeah, I do think that ultimately the formulas, the trends, they come down to what's your fantasy. Or if it's not your fantasy, whose fantasy are you writing? Like, who told you that you had to write that? Was it your agent? Was it your editor? Was it your publisher? Was it your husband? Was it your wife? Was it your best friend or your best friend's kids? Like, where did you get it from? Where, like, whose, if not yours? It's someone's fantasy. We know that it's someone's fantasy. So whose? And then I think that's the question worth chasing down for every writer, no matter what you're writing, is whose fantasy are you writing? Because when the hashtag third fantasy, the family dynamic, they have a very healthy family dynamic. I am making it so, right? The sisters are 15, 15, and 16. They're not twins, but they were just born like 9 months apart because one of them is a preemie. Like, they're very close in age. And they are very close. They're really close. Even when they disagree, it's like, oh, that's a mistake and that's really stupid, but I got your back, what are we doing? Right? Like, it's not a story of no mistakes. It's a story of mistakes, of hubris, of being humbled without being broken, right? Like, you don't have to be, and I won't even say not without being broken. I mentioned a friend of mine that tweeted this in our last in our last conversation I had with Bree and Shay. And she tweeted, it can be humbling without being crumbling. And maybe it's the Christian in me, I believe in being broken, right? Like, I believe in being gracefully broken by God. I don't believe in humans breaking each other, because who are you? But I believe in the power of being broken to receive something that you were too high and mighty to receive previously, right? But when we talk about humans and lessons, it can be humbling without being crumbling. You can help someone come to their human self, come to an understanding of the limitation of mortality without breaking who they are, without coming against the fundament of their identity. That's what hashtag third fantasy does. It does deal with a 15-year-old who was full of herself, very much so. And she has to be humbled. And she does cause harm to other people, but it's not a harm that leads to death. It's your words have power. When you speak to people that way, you're hurting them, right? So I think that there are other ways that we can talk about the ways that we do harm without that harm leading to death. Because again, there's no resolution. If I say something to Shay that hurts her feelings and she dies before I can ever apologize to her, I never had to deal with how do you come to someone who you hurt and really sit with them through their pain until they can get to the point where they say, I forgive you, right? If it's something that was so bad where it's not just going to be like, oh, I'm sorry, oh, it's okay. If it's something where it's really like, no, that really hurt, and you really caused me like psychological pain, you really caused me X, X, and X, well, now I got to sit with her and let her tell me what I did. I have to sit with that. She may say, I need some space from you for a while. We may not be able to come back together for a year. But not if she dies. Then it's just like, well, now I just have to sit with that and live with it forever. And even that living with it forever implies a certain amount of non-resolution. Because sitting with it forever in what way? With the knowledge that you did it, or with never forgiving yourself? Because the latter is not any sort of healthy resolution either. And so it just comes back to whose fantasy are you writing? What are you representing? And why is that the trend that you're capitulating to? Like, what's the incentive? What is the incentive for you to write that? What's the incentive for me to write it? And for me, it's that I want to see healthy Black families, and I want to see Black fun. I want to see people, like, we can talk about joy, we can theorize about joy, again, particularly from a Christian perspective for me, because I'm a Christian and I did grow up in a 2-parent Christian house. So we could talk about the difference between joy and happiness and whatever. But I'm talking about on the page, in the moment, fun. Just Black kids just getting to be children. I want to see that. And they are children in a way that I was not that I didn't get to, but their childhood is different than mine. But when it comes to that story, I'm in a particular representation that I'm trying to push that I don't see in the stories. Because like Shay said, what if it becomes a TV show? What if it becomes a movie? Then your book has secondary and tertiary life. And that representation that you kept is being doubled and tripled, being reproduced throughout media forms. And if it was a negative one, then it's getting pushed and pushed and pushed of Black people in pain once again, which we already see on the news. So I'm just like, why? That's why I'm like, what's the incentive? And what is your goal? And what is your politic of writing? You don't have to share mine, but I firmly believe that everyone has one. I firmly believe that every Black writer has a politic, even if it doesn't match the next Black person. So what is your politic that is what you're choosing to represent? And that is why I'm like, it's not Jessica Brody's fault. The fact that she's the inspiration or she is the blueprint, what you are choosing to do and how you're choosing to apply it goes into, it's filtering through your own politic. And that's my whole thing.
I fully agree. Like I said, I think the number one thing is when we are considering these stories, right? Like we've acknowledged that there are stories that do this, right? We have acknowledged that some stories are doing these things that we say that we dislike, but they have a reason and there's a method to the madness and things like that. So we're not talking about those specifically, and we just want to make sure we reiterate that we're talking about on a general scale, these general things that have become trends and tropes in these stories and how they are affecting what is out there. Right? They're affecting new writers and how new writers are telling stories and what they feel they can tell and how they feel they have to, right? Like, it's like all these things have more effects outside of just you wanting to write a story that was your experience, right? That's all you wanted to do, right? You wanted to write a story that was your experience. You have to acknowledge that doing that one thing and publishing it has far-reaching effects that you have no control over. So you have to be mindful of that, right? Like that's why we talk about people, you just can't just tweet out anything anymore, right? Because they have lasting effects. There are other things. This might be your opinion and you might feel this and it might just be what you think, but what you think and how you put it out there once it is out for public consumption is no longer in your control. Like, and I feel for me, I'm just wanting to do everything I can to make sure that whatever does get out there is as much in my control as it could possibly be. So I know if I don't write anything that's going to put me in a situation I don't want to be in, you're not going to have that ammunition. Right. You're not going to be able to be like, well, there's anti-Black sentiments because you're not going to find them because they're not going to be there. Like that's a different thing, right? People aren't going to have a whole identity conversation on if I feel like I'm not Black enough or if I'm still holding on to my childhood trauma because the book isn't going to be about me because I'm not writing it for me.
Yeah. And that's why I'm like, I'm interested to see what their second book is going to be. Because if it's your first book, all right, what's next? Your experience is out there. What you going to write now? And that's what I am really, really wanting to see from people who I have been like, I can tell you're a good storyteller. I have deep reservations about the way you told this story, about what you chose to center, about who you chose to absent, because it is a choice. Whatever the justification, and even if I can buy the justification, it's still a choice. So then what is next once this has been told? And I really, really am, I can't wait to see. And I'm not saying that in a like malicious way. I'm just really curious. What's next if this is your experience and this is like everything is going into this is your experience? So what's next after your experience is written? And that again goes into your politic. So I think that we are in a very interesting time where we're seeing Blackness get in a way a hyper visibility, but it's still an underrepresentation because it's an overrepresentation of narrow experiences of Blackness without panning out to see the fuller community, to see fuller experiences, to see Black people in actual community versus putting these Black people in distress in a sea of whiteness. Like we're seeing a very narrow view of it. So it'll be interesting to see who is the next wave of writers and what do their stories look like. And then what is the life of these authors afterwards? Not that I'm expecting them to like disappear or anything, but like, again, what's your canon gonna be, right? So thank y'all for rocking with us in this. I mean, whoa, my goodness, roller coaster. We started off kind of light, just talking about like Jessica Brody and here's what the book says. And then, okay, how is that getting applied? We went through all these different genres. And then we got into like, if it's the ministry, then say that. If it's not your ministry, just say that, right? So definitely a roller coaster of a conversation. But thank you all for sticking, and we would love to hear your thoughts. As always, it's okay to disagree with me. It's okay to disagree with Shay. It's okay to disagree with us collectively. Be respectful, or you will be blocked. That's it. But I feel like everyone who rocks with us knows how to disagree respectfully. If you're new here, we just want to let you know there's a way.
And again, like I said, my thing on the whole, like I said, that's my belief about it being selfish. You could think it's not, but I also believe that the truth of the matter is, on reflecting, you have to admit that part of it is some selfishness. Part of it is wanting to feel seen, and there's nothing wrong with that. Like, being selfish at times is not wrong. So we also have to get off of this train of hearing things, and because we're so used to them having negative connotations, not understanding that they don't have to be negative, they can just be factual. Just want to say that.
Just put that in there. All right.
Just put that in there.
So thank y'all for rocking with us. Make sure you smash that like button. It's always good talking with Shay, hearing y'all's conversation about the videos afterwards. So we do appreciate your engagement. So y'all have an amazing day, and we will see y'all next month.
The next Missy Elliott readathon sprints, because they're going down. So make sure you are subscribed and whatnot, because we getting our read on this month.
All right. Bye.